Okay, in this video, what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about VPN and how VPN works. VPN is Virtual Private Network, and we already kind of discussed that this is a really good technology to use, specifically when you're concerned about like a man-in-the-middle attack, or if you're worried that somebody could be sniffing your traffic, or if you're using a protocol that may be an unreliable, untrusted protocol like FTP or POP or something where the password is being passed in clear text. So what I did is I laid out a little scenario here where I've got my home and I've got a hotel. And what I'm going to do is I'm specifically going to set up a machine on my home, which I'm going to use my Windows XP machine. That's going to be my home machine. And I'm going to be traveling and I'm going to have my laptop connected to a hotel network. Now, my hotel network, this network over here, is actually going to be my Tiger box booted into Windows XP. So I'm going to do by far the simplest VPN connection that I can do using Windows XP. There's a lot of different VPN technologies that can be used. For example, a high-end, maybe a Cisco router, that would be something at a corporate level. Colleges would use something like a Cisco enterprise networks. Large corporations would definitely use Cisco or some type of router that has built-in VPN technology. More at the home level, you may set up a Windows XP machine or a Windows machine or even a Linux machine to deal with incoming VPN connections. Typically, the easiest route would be to buy some type of router or switch that's a consumer grade product, like a Linksys, that has built-in VPN tunneling built right into the router. So that would be more of a consumer grade option. Since we have some trouble with hardware and dealing with virtual machines, it's definitely worth just setting up a Windows XP machine. So here's the network topology. This is kind of how the whole network's laid out. I've got a home that I'm using a switch or router, switch slash router. It's built in. It's going to be something like a D-Link or a Linksys, something that my internet service provider is giving me an IP address. So I have an external IP address that I am getting. Now, by this point in the class, I think everybody knows you don't just plug your computer directly into your cable modem. If you plug your computer directly into the cable modem, everything from the external world will be hitting your computer, and that's very insecure. So we need to go through some type of a switch or some type of a router to give us an internal IP address range. So at home, I plug my cable modem into a router, and at that point in time, my router has internal IP addresses that it hands out. So, for example, I have a media server, which is my 23. That's also the server that I use for incoming VPN connections. I do a lot of coding at work and at home, and I use version control. So I use like SVN networks, and I use a lot of different things. So I've got one machine just kind of set up for odds and ends things. So that's this one. It's also set up for VPN. My daughter has a laptop and she's probably online, so that would be this. And I've got another computer that my wife uses, and the printer's hooked up to that, and that would be this IP address. So within my household, I've got multiple computers, and they serve different tasks. When they surf the web and they go out to some external website, that external website actually sees this IP address. So when it responds back to this IP address. Previously, we talked a little bit about NAT and PAT and how network protocol translations happen inside the router. But basically, the router keeps track of which computer made the outbound connection to which area, so that way when it comes back in, it'll be able to traverse and come to the right IP address internally. So the router deals with all that plumbing. We don't even have to think about it. We just go outbound. All of us inside the house share that same external IP address. So my daughter may be on Facebook. I may be on dig.com or something else, and the switch or router will know how to route that traffic appropriately. So my ISP, my internet service provider, Roadrunner, they hand me the IP address. They've got a whole bunch of IP addresses. I know they've got fiber and backbones and all kinds of crazy stuff that happens in the cloud. But somehow they're connecting to a network of other computers, and other people, other providers are also connecting to that whole interweb of networked computers. So, for example, I'm staying at a Radisson or Best Western. I'm staying at some hotel, and I take my laptop into the hotel and I plug into the Ethernet jack, and the hotel gives me an IP address. It could be a 192 IP address. It could be some scheme that they have up. So I'm just pretending that the hotel's giving me an IP address that looks like 10.5.7.32. So somehow I have an IP address. Their internet service provider, I'm just pretending that they're using AT&T as their ISP, and AT&T is giving them an external IP address of 72 23.31.67. So if I were inside the hotel and I surfed to a website, that website would not see my internal. It only sees that external IP address. And then inside that hotel, this is where they probably have some high-end, Cisco router or something that's going to be handling all of that incoming and outgoing traffic. And it knows how to differentiate who's surfing to which website, and it will hand back the correct data based upon internal ports that are set up inside that router. So we've got two very disconnected networks. If the hotel chose to give me a 192.168.0.15 IP address instead of this 10.7. or 10.5.7.32 IP address, it's still not routable to this network because I still go through external networks. So even if that IP address range is the same, these two networks are not part of the same network. So I can never connect directly to it. I need to always go out through the hotel, through their provider, to whoever their provider is, to whoever my provider is, back to my home. So somehow I need to create a connection going back and forth. So when I set up, in this case I'm going to set up my Windows XP machine, I also need to set up the firewall. I need to make sure the firewall knows that there will be incoming connections. I also need to set up my router at home. So if I buy a Linksys or a D-Link, I'm going to need to set up port forwarding. So that way from the hotel, when I try connecting up to this IP address and I'm using the port that PPTP uses for VPN, it knows to automatically forward all that traffic directly to the computer that I designate. So what it actually looks like is something like this, where I'm inside my hotel room and I make a connection. I'm actually making a connection to this IP address. So I am opening up a VPN client. So my Tiger box is going to be me at the hotel on my laptop, and that is the client, and it connects to a server. So the client needs the server IP address. Well, I can't use my internal IP address as the server. I need to actually use my ISP's external IP address that they gave me. So I'm going to use that. So from the hotel, I need to have that information in hand when I'm at the hotel, because at the hotel I can't look that up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the client and I'm going to connect to this IP address. So the hotel knows that it needs to go through their ISP. Their ISP knows who their backbone is, goes all the way over to the internet, says, okay, well, this is a Roadrunner IP address. Roadrunner then finally finds my IP address. My router says, oh, I'm getting an incoming connection using PPTP, and it knows to automatically forward it to the box that I set up as being my VPN server. So I need a server box and a client box. The server box needs to be set up and configured before I leave to the hotel. If it isn't, it won't work. So This is the scenario that we're going to do. Now, some people struggle finding their external IP address. The easiest way is just Googling what is my IP. So if you just go to Google and type in, and Google obviously runs into this quite often, so they built it right into the Google search. So it shows what my IP address is. For whatever reason, if Google changed the algorithm by the time you watch this video, all you have to do is click on one of the hyperlinks and they're just going to pull your IP. So it's pretty easy to get your external IP address, but you need to do that Google search from within the network that you're on. So I need to be at home, I need to Google what is my IP. At that point in time, I know what my external IP address is. So that way when I'm at the hotel, I can connect to my home machine. And actually, I'm connecting to my home router, and then my router, I need to set up port forwarding within my router to get to my home machine. So that's what we're going to do. I'm going to actually start by just setting up my home server. So that's going to be this machine over here. My home server is going to be my Windows XP. So I'm just going to go over to my Windows XP machine. Okay. And then I also booted up my Tiger Box. Now, your Tiger Box, when you boot up the Tiger Box, it may boot into Backtrack, depending on how you set it up. You may need to do a Control-Alt-Insert to reboot the Tiger Box. Then you'll get to that boot menu, and then you'll have to arrow down to Windows XP. So your Tiger Box, when you power that on, you have that boot menu, and if you don't see the boot menu right away, you may just see the Tiger Box. You'll just have to reboot the machine, and then you'll see the boot menu. But I'm not going to work on the Tiger Box just yet. I'm actually going to work on my Windows XP machine. So I am going to first go to my control panel. Within my control panel, I have network connections. So I'm going to open up my network connections, and depending on your view, you may have a panel over on the left-hand side, or it may look just like mine. Either way, towards the top of the left-hand panel, you'll see New Connection Wizard or Create New Connection, or you'll see it down here. So I'm just going to go through the New Connection Wizard. It's actually pretty straightforward. I'm going to go next. I have a couple of options. I'm actually going to go down to the very last option, and I want to set up an advanced connection. And the reason that I'm setting up an advanced connection is I don't want to set up a client. I want to actually set up a server, and that's more advanced. So the default is accept incoming connections, and that's correct. I want to set up an incoming connection, or accept incoming connections. Now, I really don't care at all about LTP. That's your old school printer ports. I'm not going to connect to the computer using LTP. 10 years, 15 years ago, people networked through LTP. We're not going to do that. So I'm just going to not check it. I'm going to leave it alone. Just going to click next. Pretend like I didn't see that screen. Okay, so do not allow virtual connections or allow virtual private. I want to allow virtual private connection. So I'm going to allow people to connect to my machine. In here, it's letting me know that the system will modify the firewall. You may have turned your firewall off. In that case, you won't have any problems. If you left it on, it should be configured. If it isn't and you run into problems, you may need to set up an exception. So what I did is I did set up a user. I'm going to reset that user up again. I'm going to create a new user. I don't want any of the existing users. I want to create a brand new one. So I'm going to just click on add, and I'm going to create a user called VPN user. And I'm going to have all the credentials just being VPN user. Now in the real world, obviously I wouldn't do that. I'd probably have a more complex passphrase that I'm using. My goal is just to get everybody to have exposure to what VPN is, and I want everyone to be able to connect successfully. So for right now, I'm just using a simple password. In the real world, please use strong passwords. My goal is just to get everybody to experience the connection. Okay, so my VPN user is set up. So I'm going to go next. And by default, they select everything, and I really do want everything selected. So I do want TCP/IP. I do want printer sharing. So I'm gonna go next, and I'm gonna hit finish. So at this point, I have a new thing within my network connections dialog. I actually have this incoming connections, and it's showing that no one is connected to my network. This is what allows me to set it up as a VPN server. So I can close that down, and life is good as long as the machine's up and as long as the firewall is configured and as long as my router's configured. Now, we're set up in a simpler environment. We're all on the same IP address, all in the same subnet range. So it isn't that complicated. But in the real world, you'd probably have to set up port forwarding on your router. And every router handles it a little bit differently. So you'll have to actually, read the setup guide. So I want to actually open that back up. I'm going to go back to my control panel and I'm going to open up. I don't need it open. It doesn't have to be open, but I actually want to watch as I connect to see that connection take place. So I'm also going to need my IP address. So I'm just going to get my IP address. And this is my home network over here. So I've got 10.7.66.94. So what I want to do is I'm going to come over here, and just for grins, I'm going to do a CMD as well. And I'm going to do an IP config. And I can see I've got one IP address, and we're on the same network. So this is not that cool, because really what we're doing is we're connecting inside this bubble. But it will work if we're doing it this way as well. It would have been cooler, but with the virtual machines, we're all on the same network, so it isn't as neat as it seems. But so over here, I'm on my Tiger box. I can see I have one IP address. Now, what I want to do is I want to connect over to my Windows XP machine. So I am going to go over to my control panel, and I am going to go to my network. So I have network connections, and right now I've got one connection here, and that's the physical connection that I have to the internet. But I want to create a new connection. And it's that same wizard that we used before. We're going through the same process. I'm going to go next. This time, instead of setting up an advanced connection, we already have our server set up. So we're going to set up connect to a workplace. So this is what typically I use. If I needed to connect to my employer's place, or if I want to connect to work, or if I want to connect to my home machine, this would be the client. So I'm just going to use a client, and I'm going to connect to my home. So I'm going to go next. And I don't want to use a dial-up. I want to use the virtual private network. So this is what gives me that encrypted tunnel. So I'm going to make an encrypted connection from my machine to my home machine. So the company name, I'm actually going to do home. I'm going to go next. Now I need to know the IP address. So over here, that would be this IP address. You need to know what are you connecting to. Now we're connecting over here to the Windows XP machine. So ours is set up a little bit different, but it's going to be 10.7.66.94. And I'm going to go next. I'm going to say finish. So it opens up this little dialog. So at this point, I've got my home computer, and I'm just going to type in VPN user, and the password is exactly the same just because I don't want us to forget. And I'm going to click on connect. So at this point, it tried to establish a connection. If it fails, hit retry a couple of times and it probably will go through. At first, it may have some issues with the firewall settings. I think when you hit retry a couple of times, it eventually will get all settings in the firewall worked out. That's my guess. So home computer is now connected. So over here, if I do an IP config again, I'm just going to hit my up arrow and hit enter. Now I have two IP addresses. I've got one that Fox Valley Tech gave me, but I have one that I'm getting from my home computer. So this computer actually is giving me an internal IP address. So if I take a look at this picture again, what would actually be happening is it would be like my home computer is giving me a 192.168.0.33 IP address. So now I'm actually getting an IP address as if I were plugging my laptop into that home computer. And now, since I'm connected, and I made a direct connection to this computer is the computer that dished out an IP address over here. But now I can actually ping every machine. So if my daughter wants to hook up and play a game of Doom or something like that, I would have an IP address internally and I'd be able to connect to her computer. I'd be able to print out on my wife's computer. So I'm truly a member of this network. If I wanted to FTP or if I wanted to use some encrypted protocol, I could do that just as if I were at home doing it. So I don't have to worry about other members at the hotel sniffing the network, or if I was at a coffee shop, I wouldn't have to worry about people trying to do a man-in-the-middle attack. They could still do it, but they wouldn't see anything but encrypted traffic. So everything is really tight, really secure. So at this point, everything is good, life is good. The one thing I do want to point out is if you are connected to a VPN, at the end of your session, so for example, when I'm at home, I'll be working on things and it'll be like, oh, I need to do this addition to the program, but I need to get access to maybe my employer's database. So I'll connect to my employer. I will work on my program and connect to the database. So this is just like I am connected at work to my employer's network, and I have access to all of those resources. Now, the one thing that I need to remember is when I'm done, I need to disconnect, because later on that evening, if I'm sitting on Facebook or if I'm, surfing the web, all of my traffic, even though I'm at home and I am connected to Roadrunner, all my traffic is being securely routed to my employer. So when I'm surfing Facebook or doing whatever I'm doing at home, that's going through my employer's outbound gateway. So any filters they have or any logging they have, they will see my traffic. So they may be like, hey, why were you, surfing Facebook for 45 minutes, at 10:30 last night? I don't want that. So what I do is as soon as I'm done working on the application, I'm done with everything that my employer requires me to do, I'll just right click and disconnect. And then that just broke that established connection. So if I did an IP config again, this should be gone. Now I only have one IP address, and that's the IP address that my ISP is giving me. So that's an overview of VPN. Hope you enjoyed the video.